So Samuel, in our text, he serves in Israel in three different capacities. He is a prophet. He also serves as a priest, and he is a judge. And so he's a busy guy. He's doing all kinds of things. But in the text here in 1 Samuel in chapter 8, it tells us that he was an old man, and the elders of Israel have come to him, and they are concerned. His sons are evil, and they don't want his sons to serve in some capacity among the people as an authority. He's old, and in fact, they tell him as much. Isn't that pleasant? You're old. But he was old. Now, he's not about to die, but they don't know that. And so they're looking for him to do something for them whereby, we're going to have the kind of leadership that we want. And emphasis there on what they want, not what they need, not what they should have, but what they want. And so the request is, appoint a king over us like the nations. They didn't ask him to pray to the Lord and seek a solution for their leadership issue. That would have been a good thing to do. They just simply asked him to install a king among them. In verse 6, it states that the prophet was displeased with their request. Most Bible translations use the word displeased here. A few have different words. Common English Version uses the word upset. The Living Bible says terribly upset. The Message, this isn't me saying go get yourself the Message, but the Message says he was crushed. And really that one, I think, captures the idea here better than he was displeased. Yes, he was displeased, but it's more than displeased. He was crushed. The Hebrew word that is used, Strong's defines it as to be broken up or grievous. The Brown, Driver, and Briggs defines the word as to tremble or to quiver. Their request upset him greatly. And it's not that they weren't zealous for his sons. He's not zealous for his sons. It's also not so much that they want some kind of new leadership. That happens, right? The leadership gets old and needs to be replaced. He wasn't judge in Israel forever. There was a judge before him. He hasn't been the only prophet around. He hasn't been the only priest around. And so there's going to be a replacement of leadership. Certainly that comes into play. But they're rejecting the will of God and the way of God in doing this. Now, is there, in some sense, a personal rejection? Yes, there is. And I think that enters into it here. But their request for a king meant that they were setting God's way aside. And in the process of doing that, they were setting Samuel aside. They wanted a king. They don't want a prophet. They don't want a priest. They don't want a judge. They want a king. And again, the key in all of that is so that they can be like the nations around them. Whenever God's people want to be like those who are around them, it is a problem. God's people are called to be holy, called to be set apart, called to be distinct. But they want to blend in. And so Samuel went and he prayed to God concerning this. And the answer might not have sat well with Samuel. The answer was, give them a king. Do what they say. Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you. And as much as that is not pleasing to Samuel, God then also corrects Samuel to some degree because Samuel feels like they've left him behind. And God makes sure that Samuel understands they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me. that I should not reign over them. They already have a king. They just don't acknowledge it. Their king is God in heaven, but they have rejected God. Now, I don't know how much that comforted the prophet so far as the rejection he was feeling. I don't know if it was a misery loves company, they're rejecting God. He was troubled about that. But I'm not sure that it was very comforting to the rejection that he himself was feeling. In the chapters that follow, Samuel anoints a king. He anoints Saul as their king. Saul is this young Benjaminite. He's a really shy guy when we first meet him. Even at his coronation, he's hiding among the equipment, right? He didn't come out in the open until somebody pointed, oh, there he is. And then he had to come out. He's a really, really shy individual, head and shoulders above everybody else. So he sort of fits that large idea they were looking for so far as a king like the kings of the nations around. And at first, he was not well received by the people. In fact, they acted as though they didn't have a king, even after he was initially installed, until there was a threat against Jabesh Gilead. And Saul then rose to power, and he rallied the people, and they went and defended this city. And at that point, everybody fell in love with Saul. And at that point, Saul's downfall began. Because that once shy and timid king eventually became a rebellious and arrogant king who would not obey the will of God. Chapter 13, his impatience led him to officiate an offering that he had no business officiating. That was what Samuel was supposed to do. But rather than wait for Samuel to arrive, Saul jumped in and did what he was not supposed to. In chapter 14, his arrogance led him to forego inquiring of the Lord. The enemy was on the horizon, and he asked the priest to come, and we're going to inquire of the Lord. And then he got impatient with that, and he decided to go do what seemed best to him instead of involving God in his plans. Part of the plans that he followed of his own accord was that he made all of his men be subject to an oath. Foolish oath. No one is going to eat bread until our enemy is defeated. And so his army went out. Hopefully they had a good breakfast before they started, because they weren't allowed to eat all day. And eventually, towards the end of the day, it almost ended in him putting his own son to death. That's how foolish he was acting. In chapter 15, he was commanded to destroy the Amalekites. God gave the command. Because of all the wickedness that they have done, what he does is he spares their king, Agag, and brings him home. Instead of killing him, he brings him home as a living trophy. He spared the best of the sheep and the oxen and the lambs and the goods, because who wants to destroy good things, right? He was commanded to destroy everything that they have, but brought those back, and we'll sacrifice those to God. And then he goes and he makes a monument for himself at Carmel, to celebrate how great he is. So Samuel was charged by God to go and deliver a message to Saul. In 1 Samuel 15 at verse 23, the message reads, "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king." That had to be tough for Samuel to do. Understand the amount of time that he has invested in Saul, the amount of energy he has put out in order to mold this young man to be the kind of leader that he ought to be. He has anointed him. He has worked to endear the people towards him. He's prayed for him, no doubt. He's had concern when Saul had strayed. And now it's his duty to inform Saul, it's the end of your kingdom. You're done. And what Saul did, as he commonly does, he pours out crocodile tears. He's not actually sorry for disobeying God, but he doesn't like that Samuel's upset with him. And so he pleads with Samuel, return with me, come back so I'll look good before the people. Come back and worship God with me, and let's be sure that I'm honored before the elders of our people. And Samuel would not. In verse 34, it says that the two of them went their separate ways. Samuel went to Ramah, Saul went to Gibeah, and never again did their paths cross while Samuel was still alive. Verse 35, Samuel mourned for Saul. He mourned for him. The word mourned here has the idea of bewailing and lamenting. He was filled with these grief and sorrow emotions because of Saul being removed in this way. It devastated Samuel that the king he had installed for the people at the command of God has failed. And Samuel took the king's rejection by God personally. It affected him. The title of the lesson is the Samuel Complex. I'm suggesting to you that Samuel had a complex. But Samuel is not the only one who has this complex. We see in Samuel and in these texts something that is common among those who serve faithfully among God's people in some position of authority or leadership. He is broken up and he is grieved to the point of trembling and quivering when the people ask to do what's contrary to the will of God. He is mourning and bewailing and lamenting. And implicit in all of this, I think, is that he had feelings of guilt and sorrow and rejection. But he experienced those not because of what he had done, but because of the failures of others. He felt their failures as his own, or at least it reflected in some way upon him and upon his work. And Samuel's not the only one that we see this in. There are a number of Old Testament spiritual leaders who fall in line with Samuel on this, who are on this emotional roller coaster, if you will. There are good times and very good times, and then there are bad times and very bad times. And we're not going to have an extensive list of them, but three that we're going to talk about, Moses, Elijah, and Daniel, all of them rode this roller coaster of emotion in their work for and among God's people. So far as Moses, Moses was poorly treated by the people most of the time. They really did not treat him well. They even threatened to kill him a few occasions, but he loved God's people and he loved to serve God's people and did so faithfully. And so you'll remember that in Exodus chapter 32, Moses is up on Mount Sinai receiving the law from God, and the people are down at the foot of the mountain, and he's been up there for a while. So long that they're starting to wonder, is he ever coming back? This Moses, we have no idea what's happened to him. Aaron, can you make a god for us? And so they end up giving him their gold from their earrings and their nose rings and their bracelets and whatever else, and asking him to fashion a god for them. And so when they do so, God's response to Moses is, get down, the people have done such and such. And as the conversation continues between God and Moses, we find that God is intent on destroying the people. He's just going to wipe them all out, and he tells Moses, I'll restart with you. Basically what we saw with Noah, right? Everyone was wiped out in Noah's day, and he restarted with Noah. And some might be intrigued by that and might be, feel very proud that, no, God's going to restart with me. But that was not Moses' response. Moses actually went and pleaded with the Lord on behalf of the people. Lord, they have done evil. There's no doubt about that. But he pleaded with the Lord on behalf of them, eventually even putting his own hope and expectation of the promised land on the line for them. In Exodus chapter 32 at verse 31, he says, "These people have committed a great sin and have made themselves a god of gold. Yet now if you will forgive their sin," pause, "but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book, which you have written." I don't believe Moses is saying, don't take me to heaven. I don't want to go to heaven. He's talking about the hope that they have of the promised land. Now, eventually, he doesn't get to go anyways because of other things. But at this point, his love for the people and his pleading on their behalf is such that he's willing to miss out on Canaan if God will forgive the people and give them another chance. Barnes comments on this text saying the faithfulness of Moses in the office that he had been entrusted to was now to be put to the test. It was to be made manifest whether he loved his own glory better than he loved his brethren who were under his charge, whether he would prefer that he should himself become the founder of a great nation, or that the Lord's promise should be fulfilled in the whole people of Israel. He passed the test. He loved the people that he served over. His statement parallels some words by the Apostle Paul, Romans chapter 9, verse 2 and 3, concerning Israel in his day. Romans 9, verse 2 beginning, "I have great sorrow and continual grief in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh." That's a powerful statement. Paul says, if it could avail anything for the salvation of the Jewish people, I would receive destruction in some sense to myself. Again, I don't know that he's saying I'd go to hell for them. I don't think that's the intent of his statement. But Lord, if there's some way that I can suffer so that they can be saved, let it be. That's immense love. And that's what Moses had for the people. Elijah lived in a very difficult time in Israel's history. The northern tribes are not faithful to God whatsoever, and that's the people that he's working with, is the folks who are up in the north. In fact, their allegiance is split between God and Baal, and maybe a few other gods on the side, but those are the two major ones. And so in 1 Kings chapter 18, it records this showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal taking place at Mount Carmel. We'll go through the events another time. For time's sake, again, 1 Samuel chapter 18, if you're not familiar with it, I think most are likely familiar with the sacrifices and so forth that were taking place on that day. At the beginning of the day, Elijah's challenge to them was, don't be stuck between two positions. If the Lord is God, serve him. If Baal is God, serve him. And the people were silent. They didn't make a choice. At the end of the day, the people are chanting, the Lord, Yahweh, he is God. There's no doubt in their mind at that point. And so there has been a great victory for faith in Israel, for God's people. This is a high moment, perhaps the highest moment in Elijah's life. This is, every prophet wants to do this, right? The prophets come when things are not good, when God's people are not doing what they ought to. And now he's got all of the people who are gathered there, and they're all praising God. When is the last time Israel, the northern tribes, had praised God? Oh, wow, we got to go back. Because they really haven't been walking God's way at all since Jeroboam, their first king. And so what an amazing victory, and what a high for Elijah in his service to God and among God's people. However, it was momentary. It was momentary because Jezebel the queen threatens Elijah's life. And where the queen goes, the people end up following. They also start turning away from God. And so Elijah is distraught. He flees from there, goes all the way down into Judah, like in southern part of Judah eventually. And when he stops and he prays, listen to his prayer. This is in 1 Kings 19, verse 4. It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father's. He was ready to throw in the towel. He had tried and tried and tried, and yet this was the result. He wasn't responsible for their sin, but he felt inadequate to restore them to faith. He thought it had happened, and then the whole thing crumbled. And so what could he do? Like all the other prophets who had come before him, he had failed to bring God's people back to him. And the circumstance was just overwhelming for him. Daniel saw a lot of bad things in his time. He was a young man when he was carried off to Babylon in the captivity. He saw the wickedness among his people that led to that invasion of the Babylonians. And then during his many years in Babylon, we know that he served God and served God's people and awaited the promised return. But how did his brethren do while he was there? Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel 9, the time is accomplished that was spoken by Jeremiah. Jeremiah talked about 70 years that they would spend in captivity. And the time is up. And so they're going to return. Daniel 9 and verse 3, I set my face toward the Lord God to make requests by prayer, supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. Hang on, I thought this would be a joyous time, right? Because they're going to go back to the land of Judah. And yet, he says, I made prayer with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. You know why you use fasting, sackcloth, and ashes? You're mourning over sin. If everything is good, you don't need fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. We continue. Verse 4, I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession and said, O Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and mercy with those who love him and with those who keep his commandments. And then as he continues on over the next several verses, what he points out is we're still in sin. We haven't changed. It was sin that brought us here to Babylon, and we're still there. Verse 5, we have sinned and committed iniquity. We have done wickedly and rebelled. Verse 6, neither have we heeded your servants, the prophets. Verse 8, to us belongs shame of face because we have sinned against you. Verse 10, we have not obeyed the voice of the Lord. That's him summarizing, here's where we're at right now, Lord. We haven't changed. We're not the people that we ought to be. And now, in part, he is speaking about former generations. As you read through it, there's nuance in the speech, and some of it is about former generations. But there are portions of it that are about his generation. And he says, Lord, we're not where we ought to be. We're not who we ought to be. Verse 13, all this disaster has come upon us, yet we have not made our prayer before the Lord our God that we might turn from our iniquities and understand your truth. Verse 20, I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of my people. In his prayer, he's confessing his sin. What sin did Daniel have? Well, I'm not saying that he's perfect. I'm sure he has some sin. But he includes it right along with the people. And I think it goes back to what we see with Moses and with Elijah, and they are so invested in the people that they serve that they feel guilt over the sin of the people. Even if they haven't engaged in it, they feel guilt over it. They feel responsible for it. They feel as though it is in some way evidence of a failure on their part. Well, let's come to the New Testament. In the New Testament, I think we see this same spirit, the same disposition in Paul. Paul, everyone that he taught had a special place in his life. He uses a whole bunch of terms of endearment in his writing. One of my favorite is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting at verse 7. He says, "But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. So affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and our toil for laboring night and day, that we might not burden any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe, as you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." What a beautiful text. We were like a nursing mother who cherishes her children. We were affectionately longing for you. We gave our own lives for you. You had become dear to us. We were like a father who admonishes his children. So many great ways of conveying this idea of his love. In other places, he'll talk to the brethren as my little children. He talks about Titus and Timothy and Onesimus as being his sons in the faith, right? Paul was invested in the people that he was writing to. To the Corinthians, though you might have 10,000 instructors in Christ, you do not have many fathers, for in Christ I have begotten you. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 15. And so Paul was invested in them, and he wanted to see their success. And when they didn't succeed, he felt the failures. He internalized those. He felt them as though they were his own. Galatians 4 verse 11, "I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain." Philippians 2 verse 16, "Hold fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain." 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 5, "When I could no longer endure it, I sent to know of your faith, lest by some means you have been tempted by the tempter, and our labor might be in vain." 2 Corinthians 12, verse 20, "I fear lest when I come, I shall not find you such as I wish, and that you shall not find, and that I shall be found by you such as you do not wish. Lest when I come again, my God will humble me among you, and I shall mourn for many who have sinned before and have not repented." All the same things that we see in Samuel and in Moses and Elijah and in Daniel and in other spiritual leaders of the Old Covenant, we see them showing up here in Paul. When he writes about Demas, remember Demas was a fellow worker with Paul, journeyed with him and went preaching with him. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10, "Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world." He's not minimizing the fact that Demas has forsaken God, but his statement is very much the mindset that Samuel had. They had forsaken Samuel. And God had to remind him, Samuel, they've actually rejected me. But Samuel felt it, and Paul felt it, that they themselves had also been rejected. When his fellow countrymen would not respond favorably to the gospel, it filled Paul with sorrow. We noted that from Romans chapter 9. When he instructed his brethren for their benefit, and at times they didn't like what he had to say, they treated him as an enemy. Galatians 4:16, "Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" He was doing things in their best interest, and yet they despised him and hated him in return at times. That list of hardships and difficulties that Paul talks about over in 1 Corinthians 11. You know the list I'm talking about, how he'd been in perils in the water, perils in the sea, perils among false brethren, etc. It's a very long list of here's the things that I've endured in my walk before the Lord in service to Christ. Do you know what the last but not least statement of that is? My deep concern for all the churches. That's how he ended the list. He didn't put that in the middle so that it got muddled up and forgotten and missed. He puts it at the very end. It is last but certainly not least, my concern for all the churches. And then in the next verse, we see that Paul internalized the struggles of his brethren that he bore them as though they were his own. Verse 29 of 1 Corinthians 11, who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble and I do not burn with indignation? He cared about them, and when they struggled and they went through difficulties, it hurt him. In reading Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, we get this sense of the turmoil that he went through just in writing it. He had worked with them for 18 months. Acts chapter 18 reveals that. And then after he had left, there was this combination of bad leadership and worldliness that entered the church at Corinth. And it led to rampant sin. It led to immaturity among the brethren. And so he writes back to them because he's heard a report about what's going on. And in his first letter is basically one big rebuke, start to finish. Just there's several different items, but it is a rebuke all the way through. And that had to be difficult to write, but he loved them. He wanted to see them grow in faith. And so he was willing to endure the grief and the hardship for rebuking them as he did. He was willing to risk becoming their enemy because he spoke the truth to them. And so he spoke out against their immaturity. The first chapters 1 through 3 deal with that. He spoke out against their arrogance and their ignorant self-assessment of themselves. They thought they were reigning as kings. Chapter 4 and many other things that he writes about. But then the second letter, when he writes the second letter, he lamented in chapter 2 and verse 3, saying that he had sorrowed over those for whom he ought to have joy. And he states that he wrote to them out of much affliction and anguish of heart. Go read 1 Corinthians and see how comfortable you would feel writing that to somebody that you love. It was a tough letter for him to write. He wrote out of much affliction and anguish of heart. And then he goes on to say, even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. He's got these mixed emotions about it because he wants to do good for them, and yet this letter was very difficult. It is difficult to say hard and unpopular things, even when it's done out of love. It's difficult. And he certainly did so out of love. Verse 12 of chapter 7, 2 Corinthians, although I wrote to you, I did not do it for the sake of the one who had done the wrong, nor for the sake of him who suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear to you. Over and over, he talks about his love. Chapter 6 of 2 Corinthians, chapter 7 of 2 Corinthians, he reveals that they did not reciprocate, that they did not actually love him in return. And so he gives this strong affirmation of his ongoing love in chapter 12. He says in verse 15, I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. May I suggest to you that Paul had a case of the Samuel complex in his relationship with his brethren. He loved them so much, and yet he felt their failures, and he had sorrow and felt rejection and felt inadequate and ineffective at times in his service to them. Well, those who serve the Lord and his people in positions of spiritual leadership, they should be invested in God's people. And that's why we see this in these people, in Samuel and Moses and Elijah and Daniel and Paul and others. They yearn to see and rejoice in the times where they see growth among God's people. But then they're met with frustration and with disappointment and grief when they see the setbacks of God's people, when they see the failures. When the spiritual life and commitment of the brethren is not what it ought to be. When sermons are commended but not applied. Don't say good sermon if you're not going to do what the sermon talks about, right? But that happens sometimes. When physical pursuits get put before spiritual pursuits, or when brethren turn back to the world as Paul saw Demas do, all of those kinds of things are distressing on those who serve the brethren. It is discouraging at times as a preacher to spend hours and hours in working on material and end up preaching to an empty room. And that's not to guilt folks or any of that nature. That's I understand the Samuel complex. It was an article that I wrote several years ago in a difficult time. And it just, God's servants go through this. Samuel complex is a real thing. And I think it's a good thing. You know, any kind of struggles that we go through, they're challenging, no doubt about that. But I think it is an absolutely good thing. Because if spiritual leaders are not grieved when things are not going as they ought to, then we must question whether they actually have a devotion to God's people. If they're not moved by the bad things that go on and by lack of commitment that they see and so on and so forth, what we end up with are spiritual leaders who are cold and detached and indifferent and apathetic towards the spiritual needs of people. And they do not make good spiritual leaders. And so those who devote their lives to equipping and edifying the saints, they are willing to endure the loss of some sheep at times in the Lord's flock. They're willing to go through the stress and the heartache and the headache and the tears and so forth because they love the Lord's sheep and they want to see the flock prosper. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. I believe in context, this is written specifically about those who are elders, those who serve as shepherds within a flock. By way of principle, I think it also applies to those who are preachers and teachers. Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give account. Let them do so with joy and not grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. And so may we have concern for each other's souls and love one another and be interested and attentive in the message of God's word as it's delivered out of love. And may we work together as God's people to glorify him and that we might be there in the day of glorification as well. So in closing, let me make a couple of requests. Are there things that I can do to be an encouragement to you that I'm not doing? Are there areas where I can build you up in faith where I've fallen short in doing so? Because sometimes spiritual workers, they have blind spots. They don't see things that maybe they need to. Are there areas where I'm falling short in ministering within the local church? And if so, you will be a friend and let me know. A fellow preacher wrote a short piece on Facebook back in April. I want to read it to you in conclusion. He wrote this: preachers and teachers are human, flawed like everyone else, and trying to do what they can to strengthen others and win souls. They do it imperfectly. We don't always realize how we come across. Perhaps we don't perceive what is most needed at a given time. But the work is still needed, and those who put themselves out there to do the work can use a bit of moral support and encouragement. They get discouraged, frustrated, and sometimes impatient and angry with themselves. It is emotionally exhausting, and we wonder sometimes if we are doing any good at all. Friends, my intent is to always do good, to always build up. And I seek your encouragement in that process. And I rejoice in your successes and I sorrow in your failures. And I hope that you rejoice in my successes and sorrow in my failures as well. Let's work together because we have an amazing home set before us in heaven. And we will get there as we work with one another. We can help you in some way with your spiritual walk. Let us know. I say this at the end of every lesson. Hopefully it doesn't go go in one ear, out the other. It is a earnest desire to help. If there are things that we need to be studying, there are topics or texts that we need to look at, or if there are things that need prayers, let's do so. Let's encourage one another and build each other up. Heaven is most certainly worth it. And so let's work together to prepare ourselves for eternity with the Lord. If we can help you in any way, let us know as we stand together and say.